is Kara Walker, and the title of my show. We are exceedingly proud to present an exhibition of capable artworks by the notable hand of the celebrated American Kara Elizabeth Walker, Negress. I started working with the silhouette. I started cutting paper after I abandoned painting. I was studying painting and wanted to be a proper oil painter, and I was trying to make very large gestures. And I realized that painting wasn't working for me in a lot of particular ways. And as I was going through this sort of quest to understand my own identity, I also wanted to understand my artistic identity, or the language that I was using, and what was my relationship as a Black woman to the history of, grand oil painting, and why did I like it so much? Because I associated it with a kind of power, like a kind of a masculine power that goes hand in hand with, exploring new worlds and colonizing them. I wanted to find out why I was so into this power relationship, and why I felt that this kind of painting wouldn't have me there. So I put aside the brushes for a while and tried to find my way into art making through, sort of reading and looking at other images and writing stuff, or just, like, I can't really call it writing, but sort of like, I'd have these like mad typing jags where I would just kind of put everything out there, and it was like this huge flood of information that was living back there in my mind that came forward, about history and about, being a woman, being Black, being, living in the South for the period of time that I lived in the South, and the kinds of narratives that were informing this, like, this body, it's like, or constraining this body as, who I could be or what I could say. And I sort of decided to embrace some of those constraints as far as like a Southern narrative or a narrative of Blackness. And eventually I found myself either unable to make a picture of anything, an image, like just writing stuff, or, but with this huge need to, continue to draw, because that's kind of what my, love is. It's where I got my, desire to be an artist. In a way, the cutouts, the silhouettes, were a result of a drawing practice, and it was also a result of this kind of questioning that, in the end, had me sort of removing something. You cut something out and you remove it from the whole, and then you've got, two sides you can look at. You've got your positive and your negative, and I really liked that dialectic there. And then, of course, that lent itself immediately to silhouette cutting and the history of silhouettes and image making. And, you've got silhouette portraiture, and you have silhouette scenes. You have images of African slaves rendered in silhouette. So you have the history of physiognomy and, these kind of race studies that, would posit, facial angles as, indicators of race and intelligence and all of that. And there was suddenly so much information about, this profile and about this Blackness and about this void. It was like a void that was completely filled with stuff. In the last year or so, I was kind of immersing myself in a couple of texts that are specifically white supremacist texts. There's one from the late 19th century, The Klansman, written by Thomas Dixon Jr., and then there's another called The Turner Diaries, which is a sort of sci-fi, like late 70s text, which has kind of been a manifesto for current white supremacist groups and fringe right-wingers who have, imagined that the war that they have, maybe internally, or the war that they have with the government is a race war. And a few people like Timothy McVeigh, and there have been others who have tried to activate this book like it's an actual Bible. So I immersed myself in the book to the point that I was completely paranoid about the future. And I did a piece for Chicago that was kind of like trying to reconcile these two extremely limited narratives that are written for a reader who's not me, who's not Black, who's not a woman. And I found myself trying to sort of compare and contrast, the genteel form of racism versus the scorched earth variety. And at the same time sort of trying to complicate that, or trying to understand where does a Black figure have agency within these texts that would have, the reader herself destroyed. So the fallout from that exercise was to sort of step back and do these sampler pieces. So the titles of the far end works, the Auntie Walker's sampler, arose from this idea that I was kind of just making like a piecemeal quilt of, free associating ideas that come from these texts, that come from my own kind of, desires to maybe defeat those texts. This sentiment that I know lives in the United States, but I think it's kind of a maybe contemporary illness of this desire to return to some kind of an origin, to return to a time when things were simpler, or to return to a particular battle scene in order to sort of recreate it, or maybe negotiate the outcomes of particular wars. In my case, the American Civil War has always been interesting for that. People play dress up and go out into the fields, and that kind of recreation aspect is sort of present, at least in the civilians piece. Characters wearing their sort of pork pie hats and with guns and bayonets. Fall from Grace, Miss Pippi's Blue Tail, is kind of the epic length, 18-minute kind of a story with interruptions, an attempt to kind of understand the mythology, or the mythic white woman who was the excuse given to so many murders of black men in the American South in particular, but kind of across the board. And there's something very intimate, I guess, about working that way, and kind of exposing the sort of giddiness of animating things, because as soon as you start playing around with puppets, you're a child and you are playing. And if you're playing with themes that are touchy or delicate or just hurtful and that do hurt, it's a kind of a perversion. I guess it's a perverse kind of play. The art that I've always wound up being interested in, across the world of art, always has this kind of quality of you're sort of inside the artist's peculiar vision at the same time as you're kind of looking out at their world and how they saw it. So.